Hey, what is up guys? This is Larry with Financial Lift, and today I want to give advice on ways to save money in college, whether that be you're actually in college or you're about to go to college. There are plenty of easy ways to save money in college, and I feel like the advice out there that's typically given is either outdated or it tends to be pretty unrealistic. There's advice out there to just cut out social life altogether. Don't ever go to a restaurant, don't go out, don't go to movies. And I think what happens is for a lot of college students, that tends to be so extreme and impractical that they just kind of tune it out altogether. So I hope to give some of my own personal experience and things that I've tried, and maybe that might be practical enough that you actually might find it useful. So the first major tip I want to give is to save money on college textbooks. And I'm actually going to give several different advice as far as ways to save money on textbooks. But the first I'd like to start with is to not necessarily buy a new textbook, this is a typical advice that a lot of people out there give, but I actually agree with it. And what I've found is that you don't necessarily need to buy the brand new edition, the latest edition of a textbook. If they're on the 5th edition of a textbook, you can pretty much get by with either the 3rd or even 2nd edition of a textbook, because typically all they're really changing is just, they're fixing typos, or they're rearranging the chapters, or maybe they're adding a new chapter towards the end. But even that you can kind of work around. You can make sure that you're browsing the chapters by topic. If your current class is saying, chapter 3, basic finance is the topic, maybe in your textbook it's actually chapter 4, but it's still labeled as basic finance, so it's pretty easy to find. And even if you find yourself in a situation where they have assignments that are based on the specific edition of the textbook, there still are ways to work around that. One being that you can just ask a classmate, if it's okay with them to borrow that textbook just when the assignments roll around. And what I would probably encourage you to do, so you don't end up being that annoying classmate, is to find a few classmates that you can actually rotate borrowing the textbook from them just for the assignments. So that way you don't necessarily have to borrow the book for that long. You can just borrow for a few hours, get the assignment done, and return the book to them, or even try to borrow it during class. That's what I've done in a few classes, is just, especially if it's a quick assignment, just borrow the textbook during the class, do the assignment, and give it back to them by the end of the class. So that's definitely one approach. The other thing you can do is find a classmate that's willing to split the cost of that new textbook with you. So that way, right off the bat, there's a mutual understanding that you guys are going to share this textbook and that it's going to be lended back and forth. And so that way there's no, confusion or anything around that, especially because a lot of colleges and professors are getting pretty smart and creative on finding ways to require you to buy a new textbook year after year. And so if that's the case, you can usually kind of find a workaround by splitting the cost, because if it's a $200 textbook, and you're splitting the cost, that's $100 saved and kept in your pocket. Another huge recommendation I have as far as saving money on a college textbook, regardless if you're buying a new or used textbook, is to push it off as much as possible. Basically wait down to the very last minute as far as when you actually need that textbook. Maybe it's for an upcoming test or an assignment. Buy the book, a day or two in advance right before you need it, because that kind of does two things. One, it makes sure that you actually need the textbook, but two, you can sometimes find a better deal. It gives you more time to make sure that you can actually find a used textbook out there. And there's a little bit of a risk involved in this, because you may find yourself, in a desperate situation where you've pushed it a little too far, and now your local college bookstore is out of stock of that book, and now you don't, now you're in panic mode and you're asking everybody if you can borrow that book. But, there's still kind of workarounds. I've found that nobody's really that hesitant to lend out a book to you for an hour or two. So if you can just find somebody that you can just borrow the book, or maybe hang out with them and study together, that's a great way to save money on a college textbook. The other option I think everybody needs to do is make sure that that textbook is not available cheaper somewhere else, especially online. And a lot of online places allow you to rent a textbook, for a certain amount of time frame, whether that be 30 days, 60 days, or sometimes 180 days. And what I've found and what I've personally done is basically minimize that time frame as much as possible as far as how long you're renting that textbook. It's kind of something you have to balance and weigh out for yourself, because, typically the 180 days versus the 90 days, you're only saving like 10 or 15 bucks. But what I would do is I would go for that cheaper option and really push the time frame as far as when I needed that textbook. So I'd basically rent out the textbook the day before an exam, the first exam, and hopefully that was enough to carry me into the finals. But basically I just crammed in using that textbook in that small amount of time frame. So that may be an option, but that's not necessarily for everybody. So the next tip may not necessarily be doable to everybody, but it can have huge savings, and that's to take a few extra classes per semester. And the reason for this is that most college or universities usually offer kind of a cap as far as their tuition rate. And then, so for example, usually it's about 5 to 6 classes per semester, and anything beyond that ends up either being completely free or at least at a reduced rate, a reduced tuition rate, that is. And so, for example, sometimes you can have a fall semester, but there's also a winter mini semester offered as well. So during the winter break, you can actually take a course during that term, and it will count towards your fall semester credit. And so that ends up being either free or at that reduced rate. So that's definitely an option, but obviously it's a trade-off for certain people because you may not necessarily be able to take, 5, 6, 7 classes per semester because it's just too much of a course load to be able to do and still test reasonably well. So another good tip to save some money is to adjust the way you approach your social life. And I don't necessarily mean you have to cut out eating, going to restaurants, or you can never go out at night or anything like that and celebrate with friends. I actually think that's the wrong approach, especially because, you only have this one unique opportunity once in your life. So I do think you should take advantage of that. But I don't necessarily think that should be an excuse to waste as much money as possible. And so kind of where the healthy balance, I think, lies is, a lot of college campuses offer things like, free half price, appetizers or drinks or things like that during like a weekday, for example, Wednesday. And so that would be a good opportunity to try to go out with your friends. And that way you're basically cutting your, eating out budget in half. And so that's definitely a good option. Another option too would be anytime that you do go out with your friends, instead of getting like a full-on meal, getting an appetizer, an entree, and a dessert, you can just consider getting just an appetizer or splitting an appetizer with a friend or something like that. And just kind of find creative ways to still be able to have, a unique social experience without having to, break the bank essentially. So just kind of being creative can definitely go a long ways. And to kind of go along with that point, I think a lot of people worry too much about what other people are going to think. For example, if you end up going to a coffee shop to meet up with a friend, I think a lot of people feel uncomfortable not buying something, or they don't necessarily want to just get a water. If you really think about it, most people aren't too worried about other people's lives and aren't noticing those details. So I think it's just kind of this own paranoia that people have to overcome in their own minds. Just go with a friend and, don't order anything at all. And, I guarantee you most times no one's ever going to mention anything. And even if they do, there's no harm in telling them the truth, just saying, I didn't really feel like paying for a coffee today. And most college students especially are really going to be on board with that idea of being broke and not wanting to spend any money. So that's definitely one thing to kind of consider as far as overcoming that fear and worry about what other people think. Now, another major tip I would have as far as being in college is to take advantage of being able to resell items. Especially when it comes to clothing or anything like as far as accessories, or even a thing like a desk or a monitor, for example. Those are things in college, it's so easy to resell because there's such a huge demand to buy used things. But then once you kind of graduate college and you're, kind of in the real world, so to speak, most adults are a little bit more hesitant to buy used clothing from somebody, but especially in college, especially with sororities and fraternities, for example, or just, name brand type clothing, people are more than happy to repurchase those items. So another huge discount that I think everybody that's in college should be taking advantage of, especially since they're paying thousands of dollars to be classified as a student, is to take advantage of those student discounts. Typically if you go to a movie or if you go to certain clothing stores like J. Crew, for example, if you bring your student ID, you can get, sometimes 25% off or even 50% off of a discount. But even more so than that, there's a lot of online services that you can get for free that, were free sometimes or also at a significant discount. For example, Amazon Prime, you can get a trial account for up to 6 months, and sometimes you can end up asking friends for their .edu email address and see if you can use theirs if they're not taking advantage of any of the student discounts. Or Adobe would be another service where you can end up saving hundreds of dollars over just the course of 1 year by having this student edition versus actually paying the full priced amount. So definitely take advantage of that since you're already paying thousands of dollars just to be classified as a student. Now, another huge way you can save a lot of money while you're in college is to really evaluate how you approach meals. Every college or university out there, or most anyways, have some kind of meal plan available. And it's kind of funny because sometimes they overcomplicate their whole meal plan system. They allocate like you have 5 meals per week, but you also have a $30, meal credit, but that can only be used at XYZ stores, and also, but it can't be used on this day. And they just overcomplicate. And I think they do it intentionally because they're hoping that you're going to end up overpaying for the amount of meals you want. So you end up getting kind of like confused on how many meals seems reasonable. So then you end up playing it safe and deciding I'm going to overpay on the meals and I'm going to buy more meals than I actually end up needing. So by the end of the semester, you end up having, 30, 40 meals or so that you already spent maybe a couple $100s on that you really should evaluate. Maybe next semester I'll actually reduce that amount. Me personally, what I would do is I would actually play it conservative, and I'd rather end up having not enough meals and end up having to go to the grocery store and cook my own meals versus paying for too many. And speaking of cooking in meals, one thing I highly recommend too is to actually cook these meals at home versus buying additional meal plans. And there's a couple of reasons why I recommend this. One being that it starts to build you, that skill set as far as learning how to cook. So that way, once you do graduate college, you're used to cooking your own meals and you have a reasonable understanding of what it costs to buy groceries, and you're learning to budget for those groceries. On top of that, a lot of these meal plans, they end up kind of selling the idea by saying, yes, it's more expensive than it would cost to cook at home, but you have, a variety of more options. You have a salad bar, a chicken station, a burger station, but you don't end up taking full advantage of all those meals anyways. So it doesn't really make sense to kind of factor that in as far as the price. So definitely recommend trying to cook, even if it's just a few meals per week, an additional 2 or 3 weeks or 2 or 3 days cooking at home versus having a meal plan. That will definitely add up as far as savings. But before I get into the next tip, if you found this video useful at all, please consider giving this video a thumbs up. I'd appreciate it a lot. And if you like personal finance, business, or economics, or anything like that, please consider subscribing to the channel and comment down below any topics or anything you would be interested in talking about. I'd be more than happy to make a video about it. So the next tip can actually end up having significant amount of savings, and that is deciding where you're going to live. A lot of people end up wanting to live in an apartment that's really close to campus, that's really modern and updated, and preferably either by yourself or just with one roommate. But definitely consider just living a few minutes away from campus. 10 minutes or 15 minutes away from campus can end up being a couple $100s cheaper per month as far as your apartment. And if you think about just even $200 per month over the course of a couple of years or even just 1 year, that can be thousands of dollars saved and kept in your pocket. So that's definitely one thing to consider, is consider just kind of, foregoing this convenience of living near campus and having a slight inconvenience but having more savings in your bank. Now, last and final tip that I want to give is to consider not having a car. And I know to some people that just sounds like an outrageous idea. How dare you, recommend I not have a car at college? But it's definitely one of those things that it can actually be more of a trouble to have a car on campus than it actually brings value, especially because you consider that there's a lot of people that end up bringing the car anyways, and typically you're going place to place as a group. So if you end up just offering, paying for a friend's gas, or sometimes you don't even have to do that, then it actually can end up having significant amount of savings, because not only are you saving on the wear and tear of your car, you're not having to pay for gas, you don't have to deal with the hassle. But typically college campuses sometimes charge, a couple $100s for parking, especially the premium like spots for parking. So, if you want to save on parking, you end up parking way far away and you end up having to take the college bus to go there. And so it's already an inconvenience to get your car anyway, so you don't even end up driving that much. So definitely consider foregoing having a car on campus. So that's it for this video. I really hope you found this video useful, because I tried to go really in depth as far as these different tips. And I know sometimes some of it can kind of seem excessive, but to me, when I was in college, I would have really appreciated someone really giving a thorough example on ways to save money, especially because I was always trying to figure out the best ways to save money. So if you appreciated this at all, please consider subscribing. I talk about personal finance, business, and economics, or basically any, financial topic you'd be interested in. So hit that subscribe button to stay tuned for more.